Senator Cornyn.
On September the 1st, 2001, we lost 3,000 Americans. About a week later, Congress authorized the use of military force to go after the terrorists that committed those attacks. Last year alone, we lost 108,000 Americans to drugs that are coming across the southwestern border. I think the figure is roughly 71,000 of those deaths were caused by synthetic opioids, fentanyl, and we know where the precursors come from. They're coming largely from China. This is like losing a large passenger jet every day for more than a year. Just like 9/11, just like we would react if, in fact, passenger jets were falling out of the sky each day for a year, we would react in an overwhelming fashion. Yet, the Attorney General of the United States has said he's doing everything he can. And so my question for each of you is, what additional authorities, what additional resources do we need to defeat this threat to American lives? Some have suggested that they should be designated a foreign terrorist organization. Other members of Congress have said, well, we need to use an authorization for the use of military force like we did after 9/11. But I'd like to hear, maybe starting with you, Director Haines, and then I'd like to have Director Burns address the question, what additional authorities, what additional resources do we need in order to save American lives from this threat?
Thank you, Senator. And I know you've done a lot of work on these issues, and I could not agree more with your characterization of it and the importance that it holds. And you'll hear from my colleagues some of the increasing resources and efforts that all of them have engaged in this area. I will speak for myself in terms of the OD&I, our Office of Director of National Intelligence. We have a National Intelligence Manager that covers this issue and a National Intelligence Officer. And one of the things that I've learned in the 2 years that I've been there is that we do not have as deep a bench of analysts on these issues, and we are not as, therefore, resourced as we need to be in order to really address this question. That's something that we've been building, and that's something that we need to continue to build. And I think that's
I agree with you that we are losing. And what I want to know is, what do we need to win? Director Burns, would you address that?
Yes, sir. From the point of view of CIA, as we've discussed before, we've tried to transform our strategy through our Counter-Narcotics Center, working with partners across the intelligence community and domestic and foreign partners as well, focusing on the entire network that you described. In other words, precursor chemicals, financial flows, the production of fentanyl pills and the equipment that goes into that, as well as disrupting that trafficking as well. And here I would emphasize that I think we talked earlier about Section 702. I think that has helped us to illuminate that network and has helped us in some successful actions recently with which foreign intelligence collected by CIA has contributed to. Both recent successes that our Mexican partners have had against the Sinaloa cartel, and also recent successes against fentanyl production and processing equipment in Mexico and in the United States. So I couldn't agree with you more about the severity of this problem. For all of us, protecting American lives is our highest priority.
I'd like to follow up with the panel in closed session. Let me turn to the issue that Senator King raised. COVID exposed our vulnerability to long supply chains, everything from advanced semiconductors to rare earth elements to active ingredients in pharmaceuticals that are manufactured in China. And in the event that supply was disrupted, it would be not only a tremendous threat to our economy, but to our national security as well. For many years, American businesses have been investing in China. We had a witness that testified last May, I think it was, that the current market value of U.S. investments in China were worth $2.3 trillion. In other words, American investment in China has been financing the rise of China's economy and the rise of their military might. Just like CFIUS allows us to review foreign investment in the United States, do you support an outbound investment transparency regime that would give us greater insight, give you greater insight into what we are financing? We, in effect, are financing our number one adversary, and it's relatively opaque, I think, to the intelligence community and certainly to the policymakers. Director Haines?
Sure, I'll start. Obviously, without prejudice to the policy question of what is the right answer for how to deal with this.
Would you like the information?
I think you're absolutely right that there's no question that something that would create greater transparency would give us more information about this, and that would be valuable from our perspective.
And I think Senator Cornyn raised a good point, and something we've discussed at some length, how we have to make sure we're also following what particularly China is doing in other nation states. Senator Bennett.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I just would make a comment on Senator Cornyn's question to you and your response to Senator Cornyn. I mean, Colorado is being overrun by fentanyl. And we're at a point now where when a kid dies who's the age of my children, I no longer ask what was the accident. Did they have a car accident, or did they, was it leukemia? The question is, was it suicide? Was it fentanyl? Or was it guns? And I guess from my perspective, I don't see any evidence that we're getting the cooperation that we need from Mexico to deal with this crisis at our border. And I don't know if you want to amend your answer to the Senator Cornyn or what it would, maybe you could, and this is not the only thing I want to ask about, but what would it look like to have a neighbor to the south who is actually taking seriously the fact that we're losing more than 100,000 Americans a year, many of them children, who are taking drugs for the first time in their lives and then drop dead? What would it look like to have a partner in our neighbor country? Mr. Director, or Director Haines?
I'm happy to start.
I mean, this is not about the number of analysts.
Yeah, no, exactly. That was just the beginning of my answer, but I think it was fair to let others talk. I think we should talk about this in closed session further.
Let's do that.
Yes.
I have other things I'd like to talk about too, but let's do that because we haven't made any progress. Things have gotten a lot worse, and I'm sorry to say they've gotten a lot worse during the course of this administration. Second, Director Wray, you mentioned in your answers to Senator Rubio's questions about TikTok how concerned you are, and the degree to which they're subject to the CCP in terms of their disgorgement of data and the potential use of that data to run operations against the American people. I wonder if you could use this open public opportunity to describe to the American people what the danger to them is of this platform that is run out of Beijing. What is the danger to them?
Well, let me start by saying the point that I tried to get to towards the end of my exchange with Senator Rubio, which is understand that the difference between an ostensibly private company and the CCP is essentially a distinction without a difference.
Right.
So if you were to ask Americans, would you like to turn over your data, all your data, control of your devices, control of your information to the CCP, most Americans would say, yeah, I'm not down with that, as my kids would say. That's the question we're asking. So it's really a question of data collection, and we know that they can use it to conduct all sorts of big data operations.
And what would a big data operation mean to your average citizen?
There have been a lot of questions from the chairman and others about AI and things like that. If you look at the Chinese government's gobbling up of information and data and then the use of AI and other tools, ultimately supercomputing, things like that, to marshal all that data to conduct targeting for espionage, targeting for IP theft, targeting for all the things that I and others on this panel have been calling out about the Chinese government. Data is the coin of the realm. Those who have the best information have the power, and that's what that enables them to do. You just have to look at the Equifax hack, where they essentially stole the PII of half the population of the United States. And that's one Chinese government operation. So it's the control of the data to conduct all sorts of big data operations. It's the control of the recommendation algorithm, which allows them to conduct influence operations. It's the control of the software, which allows them to then have access to millions of devices. So you put all those three things together, and again, come back to the starting point, which is this is a tool that is ultimately within the control of the Chinese government, and to me, it screams out with national security concerns.
My kids are about the same age as your kids, and what I would say is people ought to find a different platform. You know, the American people don't need to spend 3 weeks out of the year on a platform that's run out of Beijing for Beijing's purposes, and we can do a better job than that. I also just, while I have 1 second left, would say that I don't think the American people have had the kind of negotiation you were just talking about, even with our own big data platforms in the United States, our big social media platforms. We have not had a negotiation about our privacy rights. We've not had a negotiation about whether your kids or my kids should have the benefit of the economics of their identities, or whether Mark Zuckerberg should have the benefit of the economics of their identities. And I think, Mr. Chairman, that's something that this committee, I mean, it's not exactly what we're working on, but I think it's a related topic that is important for us to think
I
about.
agree with you. I agree with you. Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you. Maybe to follow along with what the conversation was between Director Wray and Senator from Colorado. For most of my time in the Senate, I've been working to try to get data privacy legislation through the Congress. We have failed. We get this close. We get very close, and then issues of private right of action become a barrier between Republicans and Democrats. I just would make the public offer to any Democrat and any Republican that wants to work to get us to the point that we've been unable to be at. I am still ready, able, and willing to try to accomplish that. And I was going to ask Director, maybe the FBI director has answered this question, but I was going to ask the CIA director, what does all this failure to have data privacy mean in the intelligence world? So when they collect, and I think Director Wray was talking about this, but what does it mean to American citizens and to our national security?
Well, Senator, in terms of our national security, it obviously enables our adversaries' efforts at espionage as well. It enables them to steal intellectual property. It enables them to get access to sensitive technologies. It enables them to, spy on our citizens as well. So, it offers enormous opportunities, I think, for our adversaries.
General Berrier, anything to add to that from a
No, I
military?
concur with the Director of CIA.
Thank you. And General Berrier, what level of urgency would you attach to the issues of shrinking U.S. leadership in key technology areas? It's one of the reasons I voted for the CHIPS Act. What would you identify as the challenges we face, and what can we accomplish in protecting our country if we will invest in greater levels of technical abilities?
The ability to secure this technology keeps our adversaries from actually obtaining the kinds of kit that they need to develop their most advanced weapon systems. So our ability to protect those chipsets, the ability to produce them in the United States of America is very, very important to keep those out of the hands of our adversaries.
I have additional questions on this line, but I think in the public setting, this is something I want Americans to know. I think it's our natural instinct to believe we are the best at everything. And we can be, and in many instances we are, but it's a different world than the one I grew up in which we absolutely were. tell me, again, maybe anyone can answer this question, but the differences in advancements that China is making in advanced manufacturing and automation, and maybe to you, General, the military consequences if we fail to advance our emerging technology capabilities.
Senator, I would say that the Chinese are advancing very, very rapidly in every warfighting domain that exists, whether that's space, cyber, air and air defense, ground combat, command and control, cyber. They are making very, very rapid advances, and the Defense Intelligence Agency is taking note of that and watching it very carefully.
We talked a bit about our neighbor to the south, a little bit further south in Latin America. Many countries in Latin America have elected leftist governments. What are the extent of the inroads that our adversaries have made in those countries which have been traditionally friendly to the United States? What's the difference in today's world in Latin America?
I think there's a broad trend that some of our adversaries take advantage of. I mean, we see this when we were talking about technology, whether it's, completing deals involving Huawei or ZTE or 5G, which, as we've all been discussing, enable access to data. This is something we remind, countries with whom we deal in Latin America all the time of the risks of doing that, especially with regard to the People's Republic of China, their economic relationships that can add to corruption in those countries, that can make them kind of one-dimensional economies, more and more dependent on the export of commodities to China, incur debts which will complicate their own economic growth sustainably over time as well. And certainly adversarial intelligence services try to erode our influence, in a lot of those countries as well. So it's a real challenge as well. In some places like Colombia, where we've had longstanding relationships in fighting narcotics and in, supporting the progress of those countries economically and politically, I think we're still able to sustain, a lot of the cooperation we've built up over the last 20 years or so. So we just have to work hard at it, relationship by relationship.
Director Burns, I was hoping you would answer that in 19 seconds shorter so I could ask Director Haines a question, but you failed and so I failed. Thank you.
Well, I would say, Senator Moran, new member of the committee, but I think you focusing on this technology competition is spot on and appreciate it. Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Haines, in last year's Intelligence Authorization Act, Senators Rubio, Warner, Heinrich, Burr, Blunt, and I created the ARROW, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, to break down the stovepipes between the intelligence community and the military regarding unidentified aerial, marine, and other phenomenon, which could pose a risk to the safety of our service members, as well as collection risks against sensitive facilities and overseas military bases. As recent events have shown, we need more and better sharing between the intelligence community and our military, and the stigmatization of the service members and personnel who come forward with this data is unacceptable. Do I have a commitment from you and each of our witnesses that you will work to reduce stigma, share intelligence between agencies, and as you're able with the public to ensure that we understand what's happening in our skies and seas?
Yes, Senator, absolutely. And I agree with you that this is an issue, and it's something that we've been trying to work through, both by sending the message from leadership that this is important, but also creating mechanisms that allow for people to do this more easily and with less sort of stigma associated with it.
And is the ARROW office fully funded in your budget?
Yes, I believe it is.
Can you make sure, because it was left off last year from both the DoD and Intel's budgets?
So, right, so it's in DoD, but I think our support is funded in the National Intelligence Program, and we'll check to make sure on
So
the
everybody
DoD.
else can answer the question.
I believe it is funded.
Thank you.
Yes. I support, Senator.
Thank you.
Yes.
A related, somewhat question is the issue of IC's agency's assessment with varying levels of confidence that most reported incidents can be explained by medical conditions, environmental or technical factors, and that it's unlikely that a foreign actor, including Russia, is conducting a sustained worldwide campaign involving hundreds of incidents without detection with regard to the anomalous health incidents. And that report was received in a very negative way by personnel who have been affected, by their families, because it essentially says there's no external cause. which I think is really problematic. I'm very grateful that the intelligence community has been determined to make sure that healthcare is being met and the healthcare needs, and that each of these service members and personnel are treated appropriately and humanely from that perspective. But I find it unacceptable that we are not continuing diligent analysis of possible causes. I do appreciate that the Department of Defense continues to do research in that regard, and I'd like General Berrier to give us an update on how you're looking at this issue and how you are continuing to assess possible causes, as well as possible delivery mechanisms. And I'd like to include delivery mechanisms from above. So whether it can be delivered by a drone or a spy balloon through a collection device or collection technology, I'd like an update, please. Thank you.
Senator Gillibrand, DI participated in the intelligence community assessment. We had a multidisciplinary team of very senior analysts, counterintelligence professionals, and technical people look at the issue. I do concur with the assessment, but I also think our work is not done there. DIA continues to focus on, number one, the care of our officers who have been affected. We are doing some work on the analytical side, and we're doing work on the S&T side to determine causation, and we'll continue that work, and I've made that commitment to my workforce.
And then I'd like a supplemental answer in closed session as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Director Haines, I've been working on legislation which would create a One Health Security Council to create a whole-of-government approach to address a broad range of biological threats to human, animal, and agricultural health. As part of the intelligence community study of the impacts of climate change on food security and social instability, how well positioned are you to support the U.S. in strategic competition for the kind of biotechnology innovations which will ensure our resiliency in the face of a rapid changing climate?
This has been an incredibly intense area of focus for us, and you've seen us put forward in budgets essentially for bioconvergence. We've, proposed quite a bit of money on this. We now have the National Center for Biosecurity, as opposed to it used to be the National Counterproliferation Center. It is an area where you'll see even our recent head is somebody of that center is somebody with a history in this area, and we are increasingly working on essentially different mechanisms by which we can both promote greater exchange and access to expertise outside of the intelligence community and biotechnology and work, but also to understand better the innovations that are occurring there and try to make sure that we can take advantage of those so that we understand them for collection purposes and otherwise.
Just for the record, post 9/11, we had the 9/11 Commission to assess what went wrong with regard to 9/11, what we could have done to prevent it. The fact that the intelligence community still disagrees on the origins of COVID is concerning, and I understand there's a massive lack of transparency from the Chinese government. However, I have legislation that will require a much more fulsome deep dive review, sort of like a 9/11 Commission report, to then inform our legislation about having a One Health approach, which is very similar as our post 9/11 approach, to have no siloing, to have everyone at the table, to do constant assessment, both agriculture and CIA and DOD and FBI and Homeland Security. So I'd like your assessment of both of those pieces of legislation with an eye towards solving the problem long term. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
Senator
you.
Lincoln.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you, all of you, and your service. Please pass on our gratitude to the great folks that work with you as well. They work very hard, and most Americans don't get to see them and thank them personally in a restaurant and other places. So please pass on our thank you. Director Haines, I do want to be able to talk a little bit about Iran. Many of us on this committee have traveled, some of us very recently, to the Middle East. Our allies in the Middle East and others in the Middle East are not excited about the JCPOA. They're not supportive of it. This report that's come out seems to be somewhat nostalgic of if only the JCPOA would have been accepted, none of this would have happened. It is a bit of a challenge when we're watching Iran dramatically increase its enrichment. Now the IAEA is now saying they're at almost 84% in a public statement there. How close is Iran right now, and what are their nuclear ambitions? Are they peaceful, or are they weapon systems, or what they're actually trying to be able to develop towards?
Thank you, Senator. We should obviously take this up further in closed session. I mean, I think we continue to have concerns. You've seen the report and the indication that that they are moving closer without a decision at this stage to pursue is our assessment, but nevertheless, getting very concerningly close.
Is Iran trying to be able to develop surrogate networks even into the United States, where they're choosing Hezbollah to advance across different regions, but also trying to develop surrogate networks in the United States right now?
Yes, Senator.
Is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. They have noted that they are trying to assassinate, for lack of a better term, some American former officials and have put out a list on that. My question for you and for Director Wray is, how are we handling that, and are we providing the adequate level of both information and security to those former American officials that have been specifically named by the RGC as on their target list for assassination?
Well, I'll start. There's obviously more we could talk about in closed session, but this is a threat stream that I talk about with my folks, my team, several times a week, which gives you a measure of what a priority is. And we are certainly engaged in the ways that you would expect with the individuals who are potentially targeted in terms of duties to warn and that sort of thing. And security varies for different individuals depending on the situation, and we're not the ones that provide the security, but we give them information that helps shape their approach to security.
Great, thank you. Let me follow up on this. Director Wray, there's a piece that came out recently out of the Richmond office that you have then come back and said, oops, that should have never gone out. But it was a piece that's in an unclassified document that came out of the memo, and the memo specifically states in the opening paragraph, violent extremist and radical traditionalist Catholic ideology almost certainly presents opportunities for threat mitigation through the exploration of new avenues for tripwire and source development. Wow. This goes specifically into these radical traditional Catholics and explains what a traditional Catholic looks like on it. Help me understand what's happened since then when this has come out.
Well, first let me say that when I first learned of the piece, I was aghast.
As you should be.
And we took steps immediately to withdraw it and remove it from FBI systems. It does not reflect FBI standards. We do not conduct investigations based on religious affiliation or practices, full stop. We have also now ordered our inspection division to take a look at how this happened and try to figure out how we can make sure something like this doesn't happen again. I will note it was a product by one field office, which is, of course, we have scores and scores of these products. And when we found out about it, we took action. We are also taking steps to reinforce with our workforce all of the longstanding policies we have that speak to this kind of thing. We've got refresher training for the relevant employees, et cetera. And we do not and will not target people for religious beliefs, and we do not and will not monitor people's religious practices. That's not acceptable.
That is completely not acceptable. That is, I had for the first time a couple of years ago, I had parents that came up to me in state and said, I went to a parent meeting at my school. Am I going to be monitored now? And after this came out, I have people that catch me and say, okay, I'm Catholic. Am I about to be monitored now? This sends all the wrong message on it. I do have to tell you, we've talked about this before. When I saw the memo and looked through it, I was not surprised to be able to see the source document that they came back through was the Southern Poverty Law Center, which we've talked about before, is not the FBI, but for whatever reason, the FBI continues to be able to count on them for who's the listing of a hate group. They have a long history of having anti-Christian bias, and there's multiple different entities that they've actually tried to go after on that as a hate group. But for whatever reason, the FBI continues to be able to count them as a source to be able to identify this. This is a very real problem. And the FBI needs to identify on its own. We have great resources. What are the threats there? Not outsource that to a group that is known to be not center-left, but far-left group and has its own set of biases as well.
Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. I want to thank the panel for your testimony today, your appearance, and also, of course, your public service. I'll direct my question or two to Director Haines, but I know this is an issue that has already been spoken to in the hearing. The chairman, the vice chairman, and Director Haines have all alluded to the important role that private industry has to play as we consider both economic security and national security, and the inextricable link between the two.
I'm talking in particular, not only exclusively, but in particular about the People's Republic of China, maybe more specifically the Chinese Communist Party, and investment in China that could undermine our security. I am grateful, as always, that Senator Cornyn and others have worked on this issue with me, and I appreciate his question about the need for an outbound investment review that we're trying to get passed into law. But Director Haines, I wanted to ask you about, in particular, venture capital and private equity firms as they continue to seek out business opportunities in China with often very little regard for national security risk or other risk. Can you explain both the national security risks as well as the economic security risks that are relevant when it comes to the business deals between those kinds of firms and the People's Republic of China?
Yeah, absolutely, Senator. I'll do my best, and others may have something to add on this too. I mean, I think China obviously is focused, as we've been talking about, on critical foundational technologies that it believes will create a sort of disproportionate impact on their capacity for technological advantage, right? And we've talked about a number of these technologies: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, high performance computing, all of these different areas, semiconductors, et cetera. That is something that we're in competition with China. China, when they are approaching this, have historically, as we've indicated, not just receive, like if a company in the United States or in an allied country has a has an office in Beijing or opens a plant or does other things, China has laws that allow them to get access to information and other things that they have there, and that provides them with an opportunity to basically force those companies to provide information that can be helpful to their intellectual property extension and to ultimately, advance their own competitiveness in this area. And they, through espionage and other means, have also gotten information from our companies, even outside of China, and from Western companies, and that in and of itself is an issue. In addition, we see that they are trying to create control over global supply chains, and what we've been discussing in this hearing in the context of a variety of technology areas, such as rare earth elements or other places where we know that, or semiconductors, and the CHIPS Act is a kind of a response to this, right? Where if they are capable of controlling certain parts of the supply chain, they will make it, they can basically have leverage over that in a way that gives them unacceptable advantage in making it harder for us to get the supplies that we need at the moment that we need it for national security purposes or other purposes. And I think that an example of this is, if you just look at Russia and what's happening right now and the export controls that we've been able to use with respect to Russia on semiconductors, you can see how important it is to their capacity to prosecute their conflict, right? And we don't want in the United States to be subject to that kind of a concern where, in fact, China would be able to prevent us from getting material that's necessary to our national defense or to our capacity. So these are among the challenges that we see for essentially supporting business in China on these sort of key foundational areas where they can get information that's of need. So it's not in everything, and it's not suggesting that there can't be any, economic relationship, obviously, but I think we just have to be especially conscious of this, and we're trying to educate both our policymakers and the public on these issues.
I know I'm almost out of time. Just want to follow up on that for you or anyone else that wants to make a quick comment. Are there sectors about which you're most concerned, purely for setting aside economic security, purely from a national security point of view? Are there sectors about which you're most concerned?
Yes, absolutely. Semiconductors, artificial intelligence, advanced computing, quantum computing, biotechnology, biomanufacturing. These are some of the most important areas that we have concerns about.
Thank you, Senator
Thank you,
Casey,
Mr.
for
Chairman.
again, raising those issues. And we've seen this play with venture firms and others sometimes even using false fronts, which is gravely concerning. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And once again, let me offer my thanks and appreciation to you and to all of the members of your different services for how they contribute to our security. In Director Haynes's original comments, her early comments, she clearly discussed, or at least suggested strongly, the need for the reauthorization of the FISA Section 702. And I think sometimes we talk in terms of codes and so forth, and we don't provide the opportunity for the American public to actually understand what this is. And I'm going to ask General Nakasone, because I've heard him in the past very eloquently share what Section 702 does. And in this open setting, I'd really like Director Nakasone to be able to share a little bit about what 702 really is and the reason why it is so important that we reauthorize 702.
Senator, 702 allows the U.S. intelligence community to collect communications of foreigners operating outside the United States that utilize U.S. infrastructure and services. Now, why is that important? It's important because if you think about what we've been able to do with this authority since 2008, first of all, provide and shine a light on what our adversaries are doing. What's Iran doing? What's China doing? What's Russia doing? What's North Korea doing in all parts of the world? Secondly, disrupting.
But if I could, that's because they're using platforms that have a nexus to our communication systems within the United States?
That's correct.
But they're doing it from outside of the United States, and it is not necessarily connected with someone from within the United States. They're simply using the platform because it's easy.
Right. Again, I think those are the two really important points. Non-U.S. person that's foreigner and it's outside the United States. The second piece is that we have built up and I think have done a very effective job of ensuring not only national security, but the security and rights and civil liberties of our citizens. Those things are not an either or. It's an and statement. And we've been able to do that with internal compliance and external compliance.
And I want to go into that a little bit. Could you explain the reverse targeting prohibition and specifically what it prevents the government from doing?
So if one of our analysts in the U.S. intelligence community says, hey, I want to be able to get to someone in the United States, but I'll go ahead and just target this person outside the United States as a way around it. We do not allow that. In fact, we check that very, very carefully. It's audited. It's double-checked and triple-checked. It's interesting. When we make a mistake, we investigate, we mitigate, and then we report on it. That's the type of attention we pay to this authority.
Thank you. And then there's also been a concern about what is known as incidental collection. Could you explain what is meant by incidental collection and why it's important to our national security?
Senator, a lot of times when foreigners are operating outside the United States and they are conducting their communications, they may reference someone in the United States. If they do in their communications, we have very, very specific ways that we minimize and be able to hide that type of data. So that is, again, the importance of us being able to, again, the national security piece and the protection of civil liberties and privacy.
Thank you. Director Wray, would you have anything to comment with regard to the need for 702?
So it is absolutely essential to our ability to protect Americans, to protect victims here from foreign threats. And that's the FBI's lens into it. And I would say, to pick up on a point that General Nakasone made, that we take very seriously our role as stewards of these important authorities. And we have, I know concerns have been raised about compliance, understandably so. And we have made extensive changes over the past few years to address the root causes and to fix compliance issues. We've stood up a whole new Office of Internal Audit that's focused specifically on FISA compliance. We've made massive changes to our database systems to prevent inadvertent 702 queries. We've enhanced training. We've implemented new oversight and pre-approvals. And all of the reports that this committee and the public have seen about some of those issues all predate those important reforms. And I look forward to being able to share the impact of those reforms, as well as our focus on our trying to make sure people are using the authority in a surgical and judicious way, which is why I'm very pleased to be able to share with the committee today, publicly, for the first time, that we saw in 2022 a 93% year-over-year drop in U.S. person queries. 93% drop. And that's not an aberration. It's about an 85% drop if you compare it to 2020. So this is major impact. This is something we're going to treat as an ongoing effort, but it is part of our focus as stewards of these important authorities to make sure that we are protecting American civil liberties, but also using the tool in a way that is so valuable to protect Americans, in particular, increasingly these days, increasingly to protect American victims from malicious cyber actors. You know, I've talked before about how the Chinese have the largest hacking program in the world by far, bigger than every major nation combined, and they've stolen more of our personal and corporate data than every nation, big or small combined. You look at the Russians. We've talked before about their treating of cyber as an asymmetric weapon, and they've invested significant resources in that. You look at the Iranians and their efforts to conduct destructive attacks even in the United States, and all of these powers are trying to build pre-position capabilities in the event of a much more serious conflict. 702 is what enables the FBI to get to victims, to warn them, to take steps to mitigate those cyber threats. And there's a lot more that we could talk about in closed session, but it's an incredibly valuable tool to protect Americans, especially as you look out over the next 5 years in terms of the threats we're going to face with great powers, with cyber, and unfortunately, to picking up on some of the questions that were asked earlier from foreign terrorist organizations again.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Thank you for raising the issue. And I do think for a lot of our colleagues, we're going to need to have this kind of explanation. We're going to need the community to lean in on declassifying specific examples, particularly vis-a-vis China and Russia. And also, you know, a lot has changed since the Congress debated this issue back in, I believe, 2017, 2018, in terms of reforms. Senator Ossoff, you've been very patient. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your focus on technology as well. And in that vein, General Nakasone.
Could we check whether we are being listened into at this point, or maybe you want to switch microphones?
Mr. Chairman, we should probably get that looked at. Maybe General Nakasone can. But speaking of technology and General Nakasone, General, I have an offer I think you can't refuse. You have, of course, tremendous assets and personnel in Georgia, NSA Georgia, the Cyber Center for Excellence at Fort Gordon, just around the corner from Augusta University's Cyber Center as well, an academic resource there. And I would like to invite you to join me, and perhaps we can get some barbecue and pecan pie as well, to visit with your personnel at NSA Georgia and or at the Georgia Tech Research Institute, which, based in Atlanta with facilities across the country, is conducting much of the advanced research consistent with the chairman's commitment to technology as a key frontier in our national security. So will you join me in Georgia, General?
I will, Senator.
Looking forward to that and appreciate the commitment. Speaking of Georgia, Director Haines, the assessment warns, quote, Russia is particularly focused on improving its ability to target critical infrastructure, including underwater cables, and that, quote, the PLA Navy and Air Force already are the largest in the region, meaning the Indo-Pacific region, and continue to field advanced platforms that improve China's ability to try to establish air superiority and project power beyond the first island chain. The assessment doesn't make explicit mention of the submarine domain, but during the Navy's posture hearing last year before VSASC, the CNO testified that submarines are the highest demand capability in both Indo-PACOM and EUCOM. We have the Kings Bay submarine base in Georgia. I want to ask you first, do you share our military's assessment that the undersea domain is critical and one in which we presently enjoy unique advantages?
Yes, absolutely.
And so what I want to ask you to work with my office on is if and as the Navy considers activities at Kings Bay and some of the emerging capabilities and technologies in the undersea domain and their potential presence or augmentation at Kings Bay, that you'll work with me to determine how the intelligence community can provide intelligence support to those efforts. Will you work with my office on that, Director?
Yes, absolutely, Senator.
Thank you. Remaining focused on Georgia, we have the third busiest deep water port in the country, and Director Wray, as a Georgian, you know this. Ports are critical infrastructure, yes?
Absolutely.
And there are threats to our ports and threats that move through our ports. We've seen foreign intelligence services try to infiltrate, according to public reporting. In the Wall Street Journal, for example, intelligence gathering equipment through U.S. ports. There's a risk of drug trafficking through U.S. ports, human trafficking through U.S. ports. Director Wray, I'd like to ask you to redouble a commitment you've made to me in the past to ensure that the FBI is fully focused on protecting the Port of Savannah and other seaports across the country.
We're very focused on port security. I haven't forgotten our previous conversations on the subject, both in Savannah, but also in places like Norfolk and other significant ports around the United States. And certainly, a lot of the comments that occurred earlier about other technologies and the Chinese government's ability to advance their agenda at our expense apply in spades to ports and port technology and port services.
So speaking of ports and critical infrastructure, I'd like to hear from you on this, Director Wray, and then also from Director Haines. Director Wray, what are the capabilities that you lack that require the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis to undertake its own with respect to the protection of, for example, ports or other critical infrastructure? And Director Haines, so you can contemplate it for a moment before I come to you, the question I'm going to ask you is why we require an independent intelligence office at the Department of Homeland Security and why the FBI can't do that work. Go ahead, Director.
Well, I think we work well and closely with that office at DHS. I don't know that I could point to a specific thing that we lack, but certainly more players on the field is a useful exercise.
Well, sometimes, unless there's duplication or overlap or inefficiency, right?
There is that. I will say that what we focus on the most, and it relates to the overall theme of technology here from a different way, is that we in the FBI and to some extent throughout the intelligence community have a big data problem, to use the cliche, of our own, right? Which is that in every investigation, every intelligence analysis, the amount of data that is available or that is being reviewed has exploded over the last few years. If you just look at a typical FBI case, we've, in one active shooter situation, for example, to pick something simple, we've had ones where we've had more data pour in than the entire Library of Congress in just one investigation. So the ability to have tools and people who can get through that data as quickly as possible to figure out the important leads, to marshal that data, whether that's AI, whether that's data analysts, all those sorts of things become incredibly important to this community's ability to marshal the data and to inform the people who need to be informed.
With the Chairman's permission, could Director Haines answer my question as well, Mr. Chairman? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. There are a number of missions that DHS and FBI have in relation to domestic intelligence work that's being done across the nation, where they're really taking the lead. And, when you look at, for example, cybersecurity issues related to critical infrastructure in the United States, CISA within DHS obviously has an incredibly important role to play, as does the FBI in working with the private sector and with others on these contexts. And the advantage, I think, of having intel elements, for example, in both the FBI and at DHS is that they're able to work most closely under essentially with their agency and under those authorities to help to support effectively the mission that those agencies are taking. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Director. We'll follow up. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're through the first round. I've checked with Senator Collins, Senator King. They're prepared to move to the classified section. Senator Rubio and I are. I think Senator Cotton and Senator Cornyn have one question each, and there's about 80 votes in on the second vote. I've not voted on the second vote, so we'll try to get through these next questions. We will then ask our witnesses to be able to exit the room first before the audience exits. and we will reconvene in our skiff here. Senator Cotton.
Thank you. I want to return to the issue I addressed at first, which is politicization of analysis and resources. And that can happen by altering conclusions to fit a party line, but can also happen, as I stressed, in priorities and focus and resources. So, Director Haines, I want to return again to page 33 of the threat assessment, where you write, transnational, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists continue to pose the most lethal threat to U.S. persons and interests. I just found that astonishing. I compared it to fentanyl, and you said you mean that in the context of terrorism, correct? So you'll agree with me that fentanyl is a more lethal threat to Americans than racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists?
Yes, absolutely.
But in the context of terrorism, your conclusion is that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists are a more lethal threat to Americans than ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah?
Thank you. Yes, what we say in the piece, and it's under the category, essentially, so of global terrorism, right? So it goes through the different areas of global terrorism, including transnationally, racially, and ethnically motivated violent extremism. The fact that it is the most lethal threat for with respect to U.S. persons is something that we actually stated, I think, over 2 years ago in another report as well that similarly laid out these different issues. And it simply is a question of how many people, how many U.S. persons are killed or wounded as a consequence of attacks.
Director Burns, do you agree that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists are a more lethal threat to Americans than ISIS or Al-Qaeda?
Well, I agree with Senator, with what Director Haines just said, that if you measure this in terms of American lives lost or people who were wounded, I think those statistics bear that out. I mean, we obviously take extremely seriously the threat posed by groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Hezbollah as well. That's our job as a foreign intelligence service as well.
I find this astonishing.
Senator Cornyn.
Just as the COVID exposed our vulnerability of our supply chains, I think the war in Ukraine has demonstrated the weakness of our industrial base when it comes to replenishing the weapons that we are supplying to the Ukrainians, which I'm all in favor of, and they're using them to good effect. But General Berrier, in World War II, we became the arsenal of democracy and saved Britain and Europe. But if we got involved in a shooting war in Asia, we would not be ready. And I just want to ask you, in terms of an intelligence assessment, how much should we be concerned about our inability to replenish the weapons that we're supplying to Ukraine and the degradation of our defense industrial base?
Senator, I do appreciate that question, but that's really a question, I think, for our policymakers and decision makers inside the Pentagon and the Department of Defense. Certainly, our readiness is crucial if we're tested by the People's Republic of China, and I'll leave it there.
Well, we're coming to the close of this open hearing. I want to make two final comments. One, I know Senator Cotton raised this on his first round of questions, and I raised it in my opening comment. Part of our job is the intelligence oversight of all of your agencies and the other roughly 13 additional agencies. We want, following on Senator Round's questions, to help make the case, many of us at least do, about 702. And we're going to push you to declassify more information so that we can, again, convince the American public and, for that matter, convince the 85 or 86 or 84 colleagues, 83 colleagues, we're up to 17 now, who are not on this committee. It's one of the reasons why it is so, just does not pass the smell test, the administration and the director's current view about giving this committee access to the classified documents that we have every right to see in terms of our oversight role involved in terms of the documents that were found at former President Trump, President Biden, and President Pence's. This trust relationship has to go two ways. and the absurdity of the position that somehow a special prosecution about mishandling of documents is more important than making sure that critical, top-secret documents, that if that we get a chance to review those and that mitigation efforts have been taken. That is not the kind of collaboration, cooperation that we expect, and it will tie and restrain our ability to kind of make the kind of trusting relationship with the non-members of this committee on issues like 702. So I want to be loud and clear on that, and I can assure you there's not a member on this committee, doesn't matter on which side of the dais they sit, that doesn't believe that. Last point I want to make, and then I'll turn it over to Senator Rubio, is that we get to see you guys, and we get to see many of you who are sitting behind you at these sessions and these hearings. We all want to make sure, though, that there are literally thousands of men and women, the vast majority of which who have to work in secret, in many cases can't even tell their loved ones what they're doing, that we have your back. We appreciate what you do. We are a safer nation and a stronger nation because of the work of the men and women of the IC, and we look forward to continuing to support you in any way we can, but we really do want to make sure that message is relayed to those not only back at headquarters, but in many cases, the men and women who are deployed all around the world. Senator Rubio?
To just echo the point the chairman just made, okay, on this issue of the documents. Let me just take a hypothetical. Let me start with this. Every agency of our government, right, they come here before Congress, have oversight committees, they have public hearings. Questions are asked. They have to answer them in public. People have to testify. The unique aspect of what your agencies do is, by necessity, it has to be in secret. Most of what you do has to be kept secret. That's the work of intelligence. So how do you conduct oversight over something like that? For a long time, there really wasn't any congressional oversight until the mid-1970s, when committees uncovered all kinds of situations involving the intelligence communities, actually almost destroyed the CIA. And the result is the creation of this committee and our counterpart in the House. And so basically, it comes down to a handful of members in the House and Senate who are entrusted with conducting oversight to ensure that not only is the intelligence agencies focused on the right things, but are doing it in a way that protects both civil liberties and our national security. Difficult balance. So now we come to, that's our role, and it's one we have to play very carefully, and one that's really important for the country, because we need what you do. But we also understand that left unsupervised, any agency at any time, especially ones with these extraordinary powers, can do things that are really troubling and end up actually threatening these agencies' ability to continue to work. Now, getting to these classified documents, I want to, just this hypothetical. If tomorrow I take a folder full of classified information, or anybody does, outside the building inappropriately, okay, for whatever reason, there's going to be an investigation. And there are going to be two things that are going to happen, and they're two individual tracks. Track number one is, I violated the law. I potentially committed a crime, has been committed because information that's classified was removed from its proper setting. And the result is that there's going to be an investigation, and it could involve the criminal justice system. In most cases, obviously, when it comes to former presidents, may require a special counsel, but generally it's the U.S. attorney that's going to look at that and figure that part of it out. Okay, that's not our oversight, and that's not our job to interfere in that. Separate from that is the job the intelligence agencies have of assessing, okay, this is the information that was stored inappropriately. Here's the risks to the country if that information was seen by someone who shouldn't have seen it, and here's what we are doing to mitigate against that risk. How can we possibly conduct oversight over A, whether you've assigned the proper risk assessment, and B, over whether the mitigation is appropriate? How can we possibly do that if we don't know what we're talking about? And that's really the situation that we're at right now. And that is that even though undoubtedly the information that was found in all three sites and so forth are things that we would have had access to, unless we can identify them, we can't begin to, A, opine over whether or not the risk assessment is accurate, and B, whether the mitigation that's been assigned is appropriate. We can't do our job. And a special counsel cannot have veto authority over Congress's ability to do its job. It just can't happen. It won't happen. And so it will change the nature of the relationship between this committee, which I think has been very cooperative. And I know we don't have a lot of competition in terms of cooperation, but very cooperative. And I'm very proud of the work this committee's done. And I don't want it to get to that, and it shouldn't get to that. But this is going to be addressed one way or the other.
Amen. And with the recognition that I run a risk that other members will come back with one last question. James, you're going to get the last bite, but then once you're done with that question, appreciate, and I think I can speak for all of the members, we would all echo what all the members on both sides of the dais would agree with what Senator Rubio and I have just said. Senator Langford, last
Chairman,
question.
I appreciate that. I know we're headed to closed session on just a couple of statements I want to be able to make in an open session format. One is I wanted to reiterate the whole issue of TikTok that's come up several times and just be able to make the comment I think we'll all agree with. This is not about TikTok. This is about any app, any electronics that are coming from China. That information goes back through China. So I don't want us to just zero in and just say this is just a TikTok thing, and if we can deal with TikTok, then it's solved. That's not true. There are other apps, there are other things that are coming out of China that are electronic that are doing the exact same thing, just in different areas. Just TikTok is kind of the big dog in this. It reminds me somewhat of our conversation several years ago on Kaspersky, when Kaspersky used to be the free virus software that you could get at Best Buy. What a great deal that you can get this free virus software that runs through Russia to be able to check your computer for viruses. We've all learned the lesson of that. I don't think we've learned the lesson on China, so I want to be able to reinforce that this is much bigger than just a TikTok issue, though they're the big dog. The second one is just the issue about what's happening on our southern border. There's some comments that are made in the public statement about this being a Western Hemisphere. Senator Cornyn and I were just at the border not long ago when we were in Yuma, Arizona. We looked through the listing there. At that particular week, as we were dealing with, there were more people from Uzbekistan that were coming across the border there than there were actually from El Salvador. When we were there, we actually walked up as the Border Patrol was arresting 2 Chinese nationals coming across, and we're fully aware we're dealing with more than 100 Russian nationals that are crossing our border every single month illegally. So my question issue is here, this is a national security issue, as we've identified individuals crossing our southern border that the FBI has interdicted that are coming to assassinate former President Bush not long ago that came back out. So this is a bigger national security issue, and what I want to reiterate is this is not just an issue of push-pull factors in the Western Hemisphere. The openness of our border is also facilitating individuals that I would assume the FBI is not able to be able to keep tabs on, the Chinese nationals and Russian nationals and others that are coming into our country that are quote-unquote seeking asylum, but we don't know where they are in the country. Is that true or false on that?
Yes, I certainly did not mean to suggest that the border is solely, related to the comment made about the Western Hemisphere in my opening remarks. I absolutely agree that there's national security issues with vetting folks who go across the border. We obviously participate in vetting in the intelligence community, and NCTC takes that role from my office and participates in trying to ensure that we can manage that.
Director Wray, are you able to keep tabs on these individuals when they're coming in? Has that been assigned to you?
We're not able to keep tabs on every single person who comes in, certainly. We have all sorts of investigations into certain people who get in, and we try to work very hard on both sides of the border to support DHS's efforts and to some extent our neighbors south of the border from preventing them from coming in.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you all again. Please take back our thanks to all the members. And I would again ask our audience, please, to allow our witnesses to leave first, and we will reconvene immediately after those of us who have not voted on the last vote. Thank you.